right. And I'm all mic'd up. There's technology happening, so I'm usually very low tech. So here we are. I'm so glad to see so many of you, and slightly nervous as well. But it's wonderful to be able to talk with you. My thanks to Michelle and the WCSA for putting this series on. I think it's an important one. I've been glad to watch the videos on YouTube since I haven't been able to attend personally, and I just think it's a great conversation. So I invite you to enter into the conversation, again, if you've been here before, or anew for the first time, if this is your first time here, and I'm glad to be here talking with you. Just so you know, I have some overarching questions that I'm particularly interested in discussing, and that's what will kind of frame the shape of the talk. I'm first interested in why we should talk about feminism and why, if at all, we should talk about it now. Some people might assume that feminism has already accomplished all of its goals, and so it's not. The question would be why talk about it. Another question I think we'll discuss tonight is what the Christian church has to say about it, or why the Christian church should be particularly interested in intervening in the conversation or joining the conversation. How has the Christian church responded in the past? We'll talk a little bit about a definition of feminism. We'll muddle through that. That's a hard one. Finally, and I know that there will be time because I think it's important to talk about, we'll talk about what feminism has to say to men at all. Beyond the stereotypes of what feminism might have to say to men. I'd like to begin or continue a kind of robust conversation about how men might intersect the conversation as well. So, here we go. I'm going to read sometimes, and sometimes I'll interrupt myself and speak, and that's because I've kind of crafted a set of ideas that I'd like to make sure that I communicate to you, and at the same time I might want to be a little bit anecdotal and go off the page, and that's fine too. So here we go. It's a bit strange for me, in some ways, to be here and to find myself being called to, and I called myself, Michelle didn't give me a talking point, but to find myself called to talk about feminism and in some sense to give an apologetic for feminism. And that's in part because I haven't always identified as a feminist. When I was an undergraduate at Whitworth University, I first encountered, did some feminist reading, and I kind of had my hair blown back in some really productive ways. But I think in that space, I didn't feel compelled to claim feminism for myself because I didn't know that it didn't feel necessary for me at that time. It didn't feel like I needed to stake a public commitment to empowering women in that space. And then I went to grad school, and I was expecting maybe a different kind of terrain in grad school, but at Cornell is probably the first time that I said, oh no, I think I will call myself a feminist, and publicly too. I'll kind of stake that terrain for myself. And that was because there were strong voices in the medievalist community at Cornell that said that if you were reading literature from the past, feminism, like modern feminist constructs, had nothing to say to literature of the past. I think presumably because Chaucer had never read Betty Friedan. And so if Chaucer couldn't have known about these feminist frameworks, then it was kind of meaningless to apply them to his literature. And I thought, well, that seems kind of just wrong-headed, and also I think not very useful or helpful. We get it's a rich discussion to kind of bring alongside Chaucer's literature and all literature. So it was there that I began to call myself a feminist, and publicly, and that might also be because I have a bit of a reactive personality. So I was ready to do a little fighting in generosity and respect, but a little bit of debate or dialogue. How about that? So it began to be important for me to claim feminism as a way for advocating for the relevance of that kind of intellectual commitment in that community. And of course we know that our identities and the ways that we name ourselves are called forth in different ways depending on the communities in which we reside, right? We are always shaped by the communities in which we find ourselves. And that's also been true for me here at Westmont. When I have students who come to me sort of secretively, kind of tentatively, and they say, like, they get real small and they say, I think I might be a budding feminist, you know? And it's like this secret, and they're giving it to me, you know, and I'm meant to hold it for them, you know? But it's still kind of closeted. It has to be a secret. Or I might be turning into a feminist, and always lurking there unsaid is that okay? I love God. Jesus is my primary kind of relationship. I think I might love men someday or now. I don't know about, they don't often tell me about that part, but I love Jesus. I love men. I still love the community too. But I also want to love women well. I want to love myself well as a woman. Is that going to be okay? I think it's because of that, and because they seem to need, and male students we've had similar conversations as well. Because students seem to need that kind of affirmation, that kind of apologetic. In that kind of environment, I feel that I have, again, a kind of ethical obligation to make an apologetic for feminism and just sort of say publicly, yes, it's possible, yes, it's okay. And even more than that, I think it's really important for men and women both to engage in the conversation. Now, that's not to say that I think it's really important to agree with all tenets of the conversation as if it's a dogma or a doctrine, as if I have like my membership card in my pocket. I am not a card-carrying feminist, although that would be kind of sweet. If you know of such a card, I would be interested just for fun. But anyway, but I'm not asking, and I don't think a good intellectual woman or man would ask you for kind of blind obedience. That's not what this conversation is about. It's about the importance of engaging in the conversation. That's my commitment, and that's why I'm excited to be here with you today. I think an important question for Christians and for learners, for the scholars that you are, is how can we love women well? How can we love women well and men well as well? As I typed that, I even thought, does that question make you feel uncomfortable? How do we love women well as Christians? I feel like I haven't heard that question too often coming from the Christian community, and that makes me sad. If that question makes you feel uncomfortable, I wonder why. What is it about that question, that pursuit of loving women well, that would be a source of discomfort in any way? So, in part, this discomfort around feminism is why it's important to discuss feminism this evening. And I should add that it's not because Westmont is Christian or evangelical or in Montecito that feminism sometimes functions as the big scary F word. Or it's not only because of those reasons. How about that? Feminism is difficult for many to claim. It's difficult in the secular community as well. There's been a slew of articles just this week in Slate and in The Nation where men and women writers are wrestling with just this question. Why is it that so many men and women who have really done good work, let's say politically, to advocate for the rights of women also have a hard time claiming themselves as feminists? It's a loaded word. I acknowledge that. It's loaded for me as well. If you hate the word and you can't claim it, super fine, super fine. We can talk simply about the value of empowering women for a moment and about the intellectual frameworks for accomplishing that empowerment that some other writers have suggested. But first, to start off, I think it's always good to start with the definition of terms, and one of our terms for this evening is feminism. So, let's see if I can be mobile. Do you want to? Yeah, that would be excellent. Thank you. What is feminism? I've given a kind of a, can you see that? It's awfully small. Oh, shoot, well, I'll read it to you. Feminists have really good eyes. Did you know there's going to be an eye exam as part of it? Yeah. I'll read it to you. Pardon me. The Oxford English Dictionary is the first of the unreadable quotations there, and it says simply this, that feminism is the advocacy of women's rights on the ground of the equality of the sexes. Women's rights because men and women are equal. The next one that's also unreadable says this, feminism asks the world to recognize at long last that women aren't decorative ornaments, worthy vessels, or members of a, quote, special interest group. They are half, in fact, now more than half of the national population, and just as deserving of rights and opportunities, just as capable of participating in the world's events as the other half. Feminism's agenda is basic. It asks that women not be forced to choose between public justice and private happiness. It asks that women be free to define themselves instead of having their identity defined for them time and again by their culture and by men. According to Adrienne Rich, feminism is about expanding possibilities of existence for women. She says this, quote, "The most notable fact our culture imprints on women is the sense of our limits. The most important thing one woman can do for another is to illuminate and expand her sense of actual possibilities." What is the possible for women? How can we help women enact that? Barbara Smith says, feminism is the political theory and practice to free all women, women of color, working class women, poor women, physically challenged women, lesbians, old women, as well as white, economically privileged, heterosexual women. The second sentence is important. She says, anything less than this kind of universal solidarity and empowerment, anything less than this is not feminism, but merely female self-aggrandizement, merely about making women kind of bigger and more powerful at the expense of some other group. This model of feminism is arguing for the empowerment of all women everywhere, not at the expense of another group, or not at the expense of the rest of the women. We all pull ourselves up together, I think, is her argument. Sherry Moraga has an interesting take on third world feminism. She says third world feminism is about feeding people in all their hungers. Think about how you might come alongside that if you're a person of faith. Rebecca West, this is a famous quote from the first quarter of the 20th century. She says, "I myself have never been able to find out precisely what feminism is. I only know that people call me a feminist whenever I express sentiments that differentiate me from a doormat." I also tend to be called a feminist when I express emotions that are not typically associated with the feminine, like anger at injustice, when I express the desire to be heard and the tenacity to insist upon it. I'm often called a feminist in that context. When I say that women need to be empowered, I'm a feminist. Feminism is, at its core, about solidarity and critique, says Joanna Brooks. This is the last one. Solidarity, finding common ground with, standing with women and men. I thought of the verse in Scripture that says that we are called to rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn, as a fitting kind of statement of what I think Brooks is talking about in terms of solidarity, or at least how I would like to describe it. And critique, which is a detailed analysis or assessment of a social phenomena or an institutional practice or a feature of language, an analysis of that feature, an assessment of it, and ultimately an evaluation. I hope to keep circling back to the importance of critique, which doesn't mean criticism. It's not the same as always looking around to point out where something is wrong. Critique is like an open-eyed desire to engage with the world, to assess any institutions or any behaviors or any languages, strengths and weaknesses, and its effects on real bodies in real time. All right. And these are just some of the many different definitions of feminism. You could go around the room and you might all have your own different definitions, and some of them might include some very important, I think, myths about feminism, that all feminists are always anti-men. They blame men for all women's victimization. That's a myth. But you just have to trust me on that. I'm a feminist who doesn't think that. That all feminists are anti-family, anti-children. That all feminists are frumpy. That all feminists are lesbians. These are myths that are kind of commonly circulate in the Christian community, but also outside the Christian community. They're just myths about feminism that are perpetuated by men and women. So these are just some of the many different definitions of feminism. What they have in common, if we're going to kind of see if we can make a claim for what feminism is, what they have in common is a commitment to fair and equal treatment of women in all sectors of society. An acknowledgement, and I think this is important, an acknowledgement that men have had it easier in some fundamental ways in our society for a long time. And that in order to make sure that women are granted the same freedoms, the same possibilities as men have been and are, some undoing of cultural habits and patterns and behaviors is needed. There's where the critique comes in. It's not just a matter of kind of silently, passively going along with what has been. Some undoing is needed in order to put in place something more equitable. Undoing of cultural habits and patterns and behaviors is needed, along with a vigilance, a proactivity to keep making wide open, welcoming, empowering spaces for women. As one feminist, I'm comfortable with that kind of small set of commitments. I mean, they're large commitments, but it's a small list. From my perspective, these commitments reveal feminism to be inherently ethical. Not only is it focused on the good for women, but the understanding is that all members of the society benefit when there's equality. That seems to me to be a fundamentally ethical posture. So, when people tell me that, they ask me if I'm a feminist, what I'm saying in the back of my head, and usually it doesn't come out of my mouth, is, right, and why aren't you? Who wouldn't be a feminist? And I think to myself, only psychopaths aren't. No. But what I mean in that snarky way is that I would be very interested in the argument that empowering women is somehow not a good idea, not a biblical idea. I mean, I'm just always interested in where can you go with that argument. And I'm sure maybe you'll want to go there with that argument. I'd be really interested to talk about that. But I don't think you're psychopaths if you're not a feminist. It's just what's lurking back there. Okay, one more thing that we can conclude from this small list of definitions, and then we'll move on from definitions, and that is this. In my opinion, feminism is always best referred to as a plural. Feminisms. It's not one, aside from the small list I gave you, there's not one dogma that all feminists buy into, other than maybe that women ought to be equal. As soon as you enter into that gateway, you enter into this universe of just a plethora of different conversations, sometimes in radical disagreement about how to enact equality for women, about where inequality for women comes from, where is it located, which cultural practices empower women and disempower women. For example, does marriage, traditional marriage, empower women or disempower women? We've got good feminists on both sides of that argument that might be willing to duke it out on that question. And that's just one question. So I always encourage my students to sound like they're familiar with the terrain of the conversation, to refer to feminisms as a plural. And then you're opening up the possibility that not all feminists think alike. And that you might be able to come alongside and find common ground with at least some of their suppositions. Okay. So why is feminism still worth talking about now? We have women in powerful positions in politics. We've got some women in the sciences. We've got Title IX. We're set, right? Why is it still worth talking about now? I will argue because women are still disempowered. Women are still having a hard time of it in significant ways. Around the world, in the U.S., and even here at Westmont. Because women in this country are paid between 77 and 82% of what a man is paid for the same work. That means all things being equal, women have the equal education, equal experience. A man is paid $1 and a woman is paid 77 cents for the same job, which works out to at least $400,000, and the upper end of that is not calculable in terms of lost wages for women over a lifetime. Because our representative lawmakers in this country don't actually represent our national demographics in terms of gender. While the number of female senators, for example, is at a historic high, that high is only 20 women in the U.S. Senate. That's only 1/5 of the total Senate membership. That's a disparity. Because our representative, and while the number of female CEOs of Fortune 500 companies is also at an all-time high, that high is still only 3%. And it hasn't budged in 10 years. Because 600 million women worldwide live in countries where domestic violence is not illegal. 600 million women worldwide. Because 1 in 3 women will be beaten, assaulted, or sexually assaulted or molested during her lifetime. 1 in 3. I think feminism is important to talk about now. Empowering women is important to talk about because as many as 1 in 4 American college women will be raped during her years at college, and many young women and men, aside from that statistic, or maybe certainly contributing to that statistic, many still seem not quite to be sure what constitutes sexual assault in the first place. And these misunderstandings about what all rape is. It's always strangers popping out of bushes, and that's rape. There's all kinds of sexual assault that happen regularly on college campuses. And that's a reality now. As many as 90% of rapes aren't reported in this country. They go unreported. Most rape victims who do report will be accused of lying, and because victim blaming occurs in more subtle ways all the time. That's why feminism is important to discuss. Because women are still taught that they matter only if they're pretty, only if they're attached to a man, and only if they're pure. Because, we can go to the next slide. This one's hard to see a little bit. I mean, it's hard to look at. This slide was reasonable to someone to use as an image to sell cars. What's the caption on the bottom? What does it say? Leave your worries behind. I think this is supposed to be a picture of Silvio Berlusconi, who is leaving his worries behind in the form of women who are bound and gagged. Something's wrong if this is an image used to, if this is a joke. We'll take the next slide, please. Because this guy's song about how many actresses' boobs, that was the name of the song, I saw your boobs, he'd seen, was considered not just a funny joke, but the highest rated bit in the Oscar telecast was his song about how many talented artists' breasts he'd seen in the scope of his film watching. Incidentally, 4 of those women's breasts that he saw were exposed during rape scenes. It's not okay. Because jokes at women's expense do have real, live, flesh and blood consequences in the minds and spirits and bodies of women and men. They have consequences. And because women and their bodies are routinely sexualized, fetishized, dehumanized, and treated as only objects designed to give pleasure. And the next slide is simply one of a billion Victoria's Secret ads I could have picked. I was looking for one that we could put on YouTube, actually, so that's the one I picked. This, by the way, this TV ad campaign is called Tell Me You Love Me, which I think is so striking. It's the deep heart desire of a woman to be loved, and this is how she's told she has to get it. This is why feminism is important. And if you think already, well, as a believer, if you are a believer in Christ, that you might find some common ground with a critique of this position as a believer, then already you're seeing that you have some common ground with feminist ideologies or feminist frameworks. You might be able to sit down and want to work together to make a better place for women where they can get the love that they desire in a way that doesn't dehumanize and fetishize their bodies. And because empowering women matters. When women are educated, their divorce rate goes down, their kids survive infancy at a higher rate, they're healthier throughout their lives, and they're less likely to be convicted of a crime. When women are given access to resources, they are more likely to plug those resources into their family, into their communities. All right. I'll just stop for a second and clarify a couple of things that I sort of have already clarified, and that is 2 things. First, I'm not suggesting that feminist ideology become another dogma that we accept uncritically. I've already said that, but I'm going to say it a second time. I'm not asking you to accept this uncritically. I'm not saying that it is in feminism that our salvation is located, or our ultimate hope, or our joy. I am saying that some feminist perspectives offer a potent and relevant critique of some cultural language and practices that dehumanize and devalue women. And that they've been engaged, feminists have been engaged in that conversation for decades upon decades. So that if we feel compelled, ethically or morally, to think about how and why we might want to empower women, we can find a framework that's already engaged in that good thinking and not reinvent that wheel. We can come alongside. I'm also not arguing at any point, any time in this talk ever, are you hearing me, ever? Not arguing that men are always the aggressors in this disempowering model and women are always the victims. That binary model of victims and aggressors is sometimes true. I want to preserve that for some instances, but it's sometimes untrue. And in many situations, both genders perpetuate language and practices that disempower women. I was talking with a friend of mine and her husband in response to the Steubenville rape trials that were going on, and we were talking about rape culture. I don't know if you've heard that term before, but my women writer students sure have, because we had a long conversation about it. He was unfamiliar with what rape culture would be, but he said, and what rape culture is a system of behaviors and practices that make aggression towards women seem more tolerable, that are kind of laced throughout a culture. And his interpretation of that phrase was that it meant that if there is such a thing as rape culture, that assumes that all men are kind of rapists lurking in the bushes, because it's all men that perpetuate that culture. And I was pleased to tell him, no, it's... You guys. Is it because we're having a conversation about ethics? Right. Sorry. So I was pleased to tell him that those kinds of languages and practices that make aggression towards women seem viable, seem permissible, are perpetuated by women as well as men. And I want that to be, I think it's important to have that stated. All right, so I'm trying to make an argument that feminism has not yet achieved its goals. Lots has been accomplished, and there's much more work to do in order to make our workplaces, our centers of learning, our political landscape, our policies that govern men's and women's lives equal for both genders. Now, the next question that I was kind of imagining what you might be wondering about, or how you might respond to this conversation is it important for the Christian church to talk about this issue? Don't we already make safe spaces for women in the Christian church? Yes, it's important, and the church has a lot of work to do. And I don't mean to discount the ways that you as women or men have felt particularly empowered in your own places of worship or in your own Christian families. Those are all true and real if that's the case for you. It's also the case for some women that they have felt disempowered, that they have felt silenced, that they have felt obligated to remain in violent situations, and that it was God's will for them. So there's powerful experiences of women and men in the church that have been damaging in this area. I don't need to get into the history of church fathers and their anti-woman rhetoric. In some sense, I would just be cherry-picking really horrible lines from different. Like I could read to you from that Tertullian says to women, "You are the gateway of the devil. You are the one who unseals the curse of that tree, and you are the first one to turn your back on the divine law." But I won't read that to you. Or I could read you what Jerome says about the troubles of having a wife. He says, quote, "If you give her the management of the whole house, you are reduced to being her servant. If you reserve some control for yourself, she will not think you are loyal to her, but she will turn to strife and hatred, and unless you quickly take care, she will have the poison ready." I'm not going to read that to you, though, and we don't have time to talk about the history of anti-woman rhetoric in the church. I'm not also going to talk with you about key passages in Scripture that have been read and misread and used as a blunt instrument to keep women silent. I think that Dr. Beers talked about that quite well in her talk in this same series. I think I would like to pose some questions about church culture now. Some of this has come from some reading that I've been doing where people are posing questions about different elements of church culture, and some of it comes from my own experience. Questions about church culture now that may contribute to the unethical disempowering of women. One of my questions is, to what extent does the church teach its women to say no when something is hurting them? To say no, to critique. I was telling you earlier that my experience as a woman in the church has often been that the language of submission is kind of the overarching language that's supposed to govern my practice, and not just in my marriage, but I'm supposed to submit to all male authority is often how I've received that. So submitting to all male authority everywhere means that I am in no place allowed to raise a hand of critique. No, this is not okay. No, I have concerns. No, this is hurting me. There's no, some people have argued that in the language of submission to all male authority, women cannot say no. And it's so easy for that authority to be abused, and they have no voice with which to respond. Another question I have, to what extent has the church been complicit in the same silencing of women's concerns as the secular world has done? Particularly in my experience of the church, their unwillingness to engage with feminist concerns. Often when feminist concerns are raised, in my experience of the church, the conversation immediately goes to the verses in Scripture where Paul says he doesn't allow women to teach or have authority, right? And then like a debate about complementarianism versus egalitarianism. And that's the feminist conversation. That's a feminist conversation. But what does the church have to say about domestic violence? What does the church have to say? What role does the church want to play in keeping women from being victims of these stupendous rape statistics? What role does the church have? I haven't heard it yet. And that's important. That's a way that the church needs to participate. The church I attend in Portland, as an example, and I didn't know I was going to give a shout out to them, but the church I attend in Portland has just given some money to start an initiative to work against the sex trafficking that is rampant in Portland particularly. And the way that they're doing it, there's a man who decided to not work necessarily with the people who are sex trafficked, but to work with the Johns, to work with the men who are participating, who are paying for the services, right? And the church has provided funding and a place for him to intervene in that systemic problem in a real way. I think that's important work for the church to do, but I haven't seen it done enough. Another article that I read that I think made a really interesting point was about the language around purity culture, the purity culture in the Christian church, and how so often it is women who are made to hold, made the kind of guardians not only of their sexual purity, but of the community's sexual purity. Women are told that they must remain pure, and the language of purity contains within it this notion that if you fail, if you misstep, you are ruined. You are impure, and it's very difficult to make something that's impure pure again, right? You are ruined. That kind of purity language generally doesn't adhere to men, is how this argument went. And we might have an interesting conversation about your experience of that. I'd love to hear if you've had experiences with that kind of language and whether you found it empowering or disempowering. But making women the guardians of the sexual purity of themselves and also all men seems like a burden that should not only be women's to bear. And my own personal anecdotes. In my family, I am closely related to a woman who had several experiences of rape during her life. When she was younger, she was raped by a man that she met at a bar. She's a Christian woman. It was the 70s. She was at a bar. Was raped, and when the members of the Christian community found out about that rape, there was nothing done. There was no kind of comfort extended. The message that she got was, you brought it on yourself. Because you were at that bar, at that hour, this is what you get. This is the fruits of that action. That was the message that the Christian church had for that woman, and it shaped her life. She took that in and didn't critique it, didn't have a language to critique that. Later on, she got married to a man who abused her physically and sexually. And again, when the Christian community knew about that abuse, what they had for her, what they offered her, was God hates divorce. That's what the Christian community had for that woman. And she took it in, so that when he finally left her, she felt like she had failed, because God hates divorce. That was the message that the Christian community had for her. Now again, I'm not saying that your church doesn't do it better. I hope it does do it better than that church. Dear Jesus. But that story is not uncommon, and that's why I tell it to you. The Christian church hasn't had a wide vocabulary full of grace and mercy around these issues. They've done it poorly, and they need to do it better, and you can help them. If you're interested, if you think that there's value in this discussion, in this conversation. And finally, I think, I do love the Christian church. It is, Augustine says that the church is his mother, and for better or for worse, the church is my mother too, right? So I critique the church, but I'm in it, and I love it. But I would finally say that the church has been simply silent on these issues. Out of fear, I think, out of getting too caught up in culture war debates, they've missed the opportunity to intervene in this conversation with all the grace and love that's and justice that's available in our doctrine, in our holy book. We've missed it, but it's not too late. It's not too late. I'll tell you a little bit about my own story growing up in the church as well. And I tell it to you not because women are required to share their hearts by sharing their stories. Not because of that. And being ever mindful of the fact that when male professors are asked to speak to you, I think they are asked to share their hearts and their stories less than women professors are. Is that true? You can correct me if I'm wrong, because I would love to be wrong about that. But I share my story because I think I also was raised in the church, and I received some common messages about what godly womanhood should look like that I fear are still circulating today. So that's why I'm sharing this bit of my story. So I was raised by my mother, who was just 19 when she got pregnant with me, and then she married my father, who was, they were both barely 20 by the time I was born. And by the time I was 2, my father had left, so that I was raised by my young mother, and often by her parents, my grandparents, who functioned very much like my own second mother and father in a very strongly Christian home. My grandfather was often pastoring our church or eldering it, and my uncles all went to seminary. Their wives stayed home. And I love them. I love them. If they're watching, I love you, Aunt Rhonda. I love you. So it was in this home that I learned about God's presence and God's goodness. We were very poor, my mother and I, and she gave me a distinct sense that God was the father of our home. God was her husband, and he was present there, and I knew it. So that was a good thing. It was also in this home with my mother and my grandparents in which I learned important messages about what it meant to be a woman and a Christian woman who was a desiring being and eventually a sexual being. The messages that I learned about Christian womanhood were complicated and sometimes even conflicting, and I'll tell you what some of them were. From a young age, I was taught implicitly and explicitly that God's primary or maybe even exclusive role for women was to stay at home and raise children, to facilitate social functions in the church community and in the larger family community, which was largely concerned with the preparation of food. Whatever intellectual aptitude women might have should be properly turned towards the domus, towards the home, towards the rearing of the children, and toward offering a helpful, though inferior, intellectual partnership for the husband. Women were also meant to provide sexually for their husband, just the one, husband. It wasn't that kind of church. It was a different, no. Women's bodies should always be available to satisfy the desires of their husband. In this model, which was always presented not as a product of history, I mean, I'm thinking about my grandparents, coming of age in the 40s and 50s, and it seems that a lot of their messages were historically based. But their messages weren't presented as a product of their history or culture, but a product of Scripture. Women were supposed to behave this way because Scripture said so, because it was God's will. That's a lot of weight to put on this message about what womanhood ought to look like. I was taught not to have any aspirations in a professional capacity, intellectual curiosities or capacities that didn't serve the home, and certainly no sexual desires of my own that were allowed to be spoken. The story for men, incidentally, in this environment wasn't all that better. These were the messages I received, and maybe they didn't intend to give them, but this is what I received. Though they were assumed to be authoritative in both the church and in the home, men were presented to me as both infantile and aggressive, which is a dangerous combination. That is, men were presented to me as basically incompetent, both at work, hence their need for secretaries and people to manage their schedules and open their file cabinets for them, and incompetent at home, hence their needs for wives to cook for them and clean for them and raise their children. Men were certainly assumed to be at least incompetent and at most an outright threat to infants and children. You never left a baby alone with the father. That father would accidentally extinguish the baby. I mean, men were assumed to just be useless in that regard. Which is, again, how God planned it somehow. I mean, this was always attached to God's plan. Further, and confusingly, men's appetites were communicated to me as both voracious and uncontrollable, for food and for sex. And remember, it was God's plan that women provide both. That meant that once aroused, men had no control or responsibility for their sexual desires, and that women were the sole guardians of men's sexual selves. If we were unmarried and we dressed provocatively, whatever that meant, we should expect that men would act upon the desires that we had incited, that we were responsible for. And if we were married, our bodies were no longer our own. I'll stop here to say that some of you might be tempted to think that these kinds of messages surely aren't in play today. This was the 80s that I'm talking about, right? Or the early 90s. This is now 2013, right? So things are better. But I wonder how many of you have received these messages in subtle forms about what it means to be a man or woman. Men, has anyone ever infantilized you? Treated you like a child? Assumed that you were incapable of, say, editing your own papers, organizing your own schedule, preparing your own food, dressing yourself? Incapable of caring for children, or that such care would even be unnatural to you, and certainly unmasculine of you if you pursued it? Ever had your masculinity policed? Certain desires or emotions or vocational callings deemed to risk your manhood in some way? Women, anyone ever suggest to you that your intellectual aptitudes, your vocational goals ought to be secondary to your ability to land a husband and make babies? And that God wants it that way? Ever suggest to you that it's God's will for you to submit to all male authority everywhere? Ever place the burden of men's sexual desires upon you to safeguard and to be responsible for? And I'm thinking of the Yoga Pants article. Ever had your femininity policed? Certain kinds of speaking or asserting yourself, certain things that you affirm or deny, skills or desires called unfeminine, not ladylike? Ever police or censure yourself in these ways? It's not like that only comes from men. We do it to ourselves all the time. I suggest that the gendered messages that I grew up with are alive and well today, if articulated in more subtle and frankly less subtle forms. As you might guess, adolescence was particularly scary in this environment, and particularly for the kind of woman I was finding myself to be. As I grew up, I found myself more and more drawn to the life of the mind, to intellectual engagement, and drawn away from the concerns I was told would mark me as feminine and marriageable. I was increasingly suspicious, as I should have been, of the gender and sexual models that I was being offered. If men were both infantile and uncontrollable in their appetites, and God made them that way, and God meant for this personality to have the authority over their wives, I wasn't sure I wanted anything to do with heterosexual and lifelong union with such a creature. And I say creature because what I was presented was a kind of ugly caricature, you know? Plus, I was finding that I too was a sexual being, and I was offered no language with which to affirm my sexual self, to affirm that it was right and natural for me to have my own desires, both sexual and vocational. Instead, I received messages about my obligation to engineer, to discipline, and to diminish my body and my mind in order to attract a man as the sole God-ordained goal of my young womanhood. Those messages were, no man will ever be interested in you if you don't shave your legs. For some reason, hair on the legs was just a deal breaker, apparently. No man will ever be interested in you if you don't lose the weight, if you aren't pleasant at all times. If you keep on studying that Greek or reading Nietzsche, you'll scare all the men away. If you pursue a graduate degree, or if you have your own vocational calling, no man will want you for his wife, because all men are wired to want to be providers, to want to lead, to want to fill in the blank, whatever it is that all men are wired to do that somehow means that women have to be small. The message here seemed to suggest that God meant for me to repress, to not act upon the abilities, the aptitudes, or the desires that he had given me in order to enact some kind of pre-packaged sense of what woman should look like. Did God really give me these desires to learn and to teach and to write? And did he really give me these abilities? I'm good at those things. Did he really give me the opportunities, like full rides to good schools? But expect me to turn away from those things to enact a model of femininity that in every sense seemed not to quite fit. It seemed nearly like disobedience to me to turn away from who God had made me, to squeeze myself into what others said Christian woman ought to look like. Someone close to me told me during those years in college that it was fine that I should like studying so much, almost like she was explaining my alien desires out loud. That's fine. But that when I found the right man, that my desires would be turned towards my husband and I wouldn't care so much about academics. Then later my desires would be turned toward my children, and that would be God's plan. These messages, alongside what I was learning about my own desires and abilities, left me deeply confused about myself. I assumed that I must not be much of a woman, and probably not a woman cut out for marriage. No man would clearly be interested in me anyway. And I decided that was fine. I would pursue academics and leave the rest. I still knew God loved me and that he was good and that he was present, even if I was deeply alien and increasingly deeply alienated. I'll skip the part about when my family gave me the book about 2 Timothy 2 that was written by the Council for Christian Manhood and Womanhood. The central message of that book being that women are not allowed to lead in the church because they are fundamentally incapable of taking a stand on doctrinal truth, because we are more relational and more emotionally oriented. No basis for a doctrine, but it was given to me. At the same time, I came across some feminist writers in a history of literary theory course, and they were the first that I had ever read. They gave me a language to articulate what had been stifling, unjust even, about the gender and sexual models in which I had been raised. Note well here that what I'm not saying is that I necessarily rejected the sexual ethic in which I was raised. I didn't necessarily reject a traditional Christian sexual ethic simply because I found a lot of empowerment, a lot of freedom in the feminist literature that I was reading. That was all secular. Just because I learned that the sexual models, the language about gender and sexuality, the way sexuality was affirmed and the motivations behind that affirmation was problematic, doesn't mean that I jettison the sexual ethics. Feminist theories have helped me to analyze and think critically about the messages I received when I was growing up, to advocate for something more ethical, more just, and most importantly, closer to what I believe is the heart of the gospel, the good news for women and men, a freedom. That is what, for abundant life. That's what I think feminist criticism has given me, freedom to embrace abundant life. That is, what I'm suggesting here is that feminism has helped me to distinguish between what is perceived as normal for women's gender and sexuality by our culture, even by our Christian culture, and what I can claim as God's will for gender and sexuality. So many of the messages I received had little to do with obeying God and much more to do with obeying cultural norms. But what I have come to believe strongly is that I'm not asked to commit to cultural norms about what woman ought to look like. I'm invited into a relationship with Christ fundamentally. I'm asked to conform to his likeness, not to the likeness of any Christian who tells me what a woman's heart should desire, what a woman's life should look like. If one more person tells me what a woman's heart is, I'm going to gently invite them to tea. I'm not going to, but you know. During that tea, I will speak strongly. What would it look like for women to be conformed to Christ and not to gender stereotypes? What would Christ look like when expressed through my body, through my uniqueness, and through your body and your uniqueness? I would suggest that what a Christian woman ought to look like would be as diverse as the number of women here. And what Christian masculinity should look like would be as diverse as the men in this room. because God created you to embody him in your unique, particular ways. And anything less than that, anything less, you're being sold an impoverishing bill of goods. And don't do it. Don't be impoverished. Don't sell your freedom. I have this section where I was going to talk with you about what feminist writings were especially freeing, because I think I'm talking about feminism in the abstract, and I should probably be more specific. But getting specific, I feel like, is going to take a long time. So I think what I'm going to do is just name a theorist and skip on. No, I'm going to name a theorist and just say a couple of things about what was helpful to me there. And that's not to say that I'm a card-carrying member of this theorist fan club. It's just that when I encountered her writings, they kind of opened doors for me. And the theorist is Judith Butler, who's a philosopher and a theorist of gender and sexuality. And I think she's in some ways she bases a lot of her writing on Michel Foucault, a French philosopher. And in some sense, both Foucault and Butler could be called like the originators of the queer movement, queer theory. What she says is this. I'll give you the quote. It's dense, and we're going to move on. But this is what was really helpful for me. She says, there is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. Identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results. I'll give that to you one more time. There is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. Identity is performatively. We perform our gender identity. Performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results. In other words, gender is a performance. It's what you do at particular times rather than a universal who you are. She argues that dominant discourses in our society set the terms for what is considered normal behavior and the appearance for each of the genders. Gender doesn't come from within, according to Butler. It's not something essential to who we are. Instead, gender norms are imposed from without. Those power structures are then involved with policing men and women to make sure they perform their gender correctly or normally. And if not, they are ejected, abjected from the normal and become known as abnormal or deviant. And for me, I mean, that's a very brief sketch, but for me this was a helpful model with which to understand my own feelings of alienation as I was enacting, apparently, a deviant model of womanhood within my Christian community, because I wasn't interested in I couldn't kind of conform myself to what were presented to me as gender norms for Christian women. Again, I think for me, she's been a really helpful place to start. All right. I think I'm almost I'm just about out of time. So I'd like to end with the following. What does empowering women have to do with men? Now, I mean, there's a long speech that actually it's a short speech, and it's this. If you know women, if a woman gave birth to you, if you plan on marrying a woman or working with women or walking on the earth, then it would, like Caine in Kung Fu, then you need to know that it's important for you to at least be open to the conversation about how to best value and make free space for the women around you. That's actually I don't know what else to say other than women are all around you, right now, in fact. And it's important for you it's ethical for you to be interested in how to make things equitable for them. But the thing that I wanted to pursue a little bit was how feminist theories have been applied by men and women scholars into a new field of study called masculinity studies in the last 15 years. So it's not brand new. But masculinity studies is another branch of theory alongside feminist studies and black womanist studies and LGBTQ studies that acknowledges that men's bodies are also marked and judged by fantasies and by stereotypes. I'll give you a couple of examples. We can move on from, we've been looking at this lady the whole time. A couple of campaigns, yogurt for men. I guess the yogurt market has been saturated by advertisements aimed at women, like all women are, menstruating and eating yogurt together, or like getting ready to get married and all the women are sitting around in their bridal gear eating yogurt. Like it's this communal activity for women. And so here's this response, and it's yogurt for men, otherwise known as brogurt. Now, it's the first yogurt in the U.S. designed for a man's health and nutrition needs, whatever those would be. But we're clear to see his abs, right? Like this is a kind of masculinity that you can aspire to. It's an idealized form of masculinity, right? Notice the man has no face, just like women in advertising often have no face. This is any man. His identity is interchangeable with any other. His torso is interchangeable with any other torso. And he's eating this yogurt in its black, like, man container. I think that's so great. What feminist studies have done is given men a language to interrogate the images and the language that are used to stereotype men and convey that there's only one type of manhood that's acceptable, right? And masculinity studies have gotten that from the strides that feminist theorists made. I was going to show you a website, but I think we're out of time. It's a longer website about another New Zealand company that's making yogurt for men. And I'll just say I'll give you the link if you want another time. On the website, I can't tell you how many times the word real appeared. Real men. If you want to be really a man, then you'll do this, and you'll go on our Facebook page and because real men like us on Facebook. And there's this sense that there's a real man, which is only one small slice of the manhood pie, and all the rest of the men are unreal somehow. Like your masculinity has dissolved away unless you eat this tub of yogurt that's so masculine they had to put it in a tub, and it's got seeds in it and like bark and stuff. So, right. The last example of cultural stereotypes of men and a masculine studies response, it comes from the Miller Lite Man Up campaign. Do you know this campaign? It was from like 2011, so a couple of years ago. The premise of this campaign is, actually I'm not quite sure, because I feel like drinking Miller Lite would itself be a kind of emasculating activity, so I'm not sure why they were. I think the premise is that these men keep behaving in ways that call their masculinity into question. Right? So the tagline is that fair for those of you who've seen it? So the tagline for the commercial is always, man up. Drink this beer, man, stop wearing a man purse, or whatever it was. You know, all these behaviors that feminize these men. If we go to the next slide, we'll see if we can see it. Yeah. Guante, who's a slam poet, who was brought to my attention by one of my students in in gender theory last year. A slam poet named Guante had 10 responses to the phrase man up, and I'll only read a few of them. He says this: if you want to question my masculinity, save your breath, because contrary to what you may believe, not every problem can be solved by growing a pair. You can't arm wrestle your way out of chemical depression. The CEO of the company that just laid you off does not care how much you bench, and I promise there's no light beer in the universe full-bodied enough to make you love yourself. You ever notice how nobody ever says woman up? They just imply it, because women in the women's movement figured out a long time ago that being directly ordered around by commercials, magazines, and music is dehumanizing. When will men figure that out? Man up assaults our self-esteem by suggesting that competence and perseverance are uniquely masculine traits, that women, not to mention any man who doesn't eat steak, drive a pickup truck, and have lots of sex with women and otherwise conform to gender norms absolutely, are nothing more than background characters and props in a movie where the strong, stoic, real man is the hero. More than anything, though, it suggests that to be yourself will cost you. I want to be free to express myself. Man up. I want to have meaningful emotional relationships with other men. Man up. I want to be weak sometimes. Man up. I want to be strong in a way that isn't about physical power or dominance. Man up. I want to cry if I feel like crying. Man up. I want to ask for help. Man up. I want to be who I am. Man up. And his final response to the phrase man up is no. To conclude, and in answer to the questions that I posed, while women have experienced some empowerment in some areas, there is still much work to do, and that work, I am arguing, is essentially ethical, and I'm also arguing that it's essentially possible. It's possible when we're attentive to the messages we receive and then that we perpetuate by our language, our joking, and our practices. When we commit to the value of critique, of thoughtful engagement with the world around us, to epistemological humility, to engaging in dialogue and to listening well before we respond, then it's possible. It's possible when we prayerfully ask how we can love women and men well. in the fullness and uniqueness of their beings. Thank you very much.